Well, friends, welcome to What is Worship Season 3. I'm so glad that you're joining us. My name is Harmony, and I'm joined today by two very special guests, Dr. Stephen Backhouse, who many of you will be familiar with already. He's my first returning guest, I do believe. And I'm really excited to introduce you to Rabbi Avi Finegold, all the way from Canada, right? And we're so glad that you're joining us. We've only just met, but I think we will have a fantastic conversation today. At the outset, I'm just going to confess that I feel a little bit more nervous than usual for these interviews. I feel a little bit out of my depth with the two of you, but I think that's good. It will keep me on my toes. I'm excited to learn from the two of you today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to our worship leaders, primarily in the Vineyard, but we have other friends who join in this conversation as well. So you're super welcome. And so
I promise we won't be good cop, bad cop. We'll be bad cop, even badder cop with you, Harmony. Don't worry.
Well, now I'm a little more nervous. Two bad cops. I'll be good cop. How about that? So Rabbi Avi, would you tell us a little bit about yourself? And is it Montreal that you live in, right?
I'm in Montreal, yeah.
Yeah, so tell us what you're involved in. You're involved in a very cool sounding project.
I mean, sure. I run this organization called the Jewish Living Lab, which, as its name is experimenting with various modes and ideas of pushing where Jewish living can and should go. It's centered around a lot of education, but we're doing a lot of podcasting these days. We have a cute, interesting little side thing where we have a Jewish evening around Jewish ideas, centered around teaching cocktails and Judaism, which I call the Jewish Cocktail Lab. So we have fun things along, all sorts of things like that. And I believe in Jewish ideas, and I believe that ideas are transformative wherever you are and whoever you are as a person. I like to think myself as a very, very tiny microcosm of the ideas that, like, the School of Life does in London, which is, like this school that teaches philosophy as a way to change your life. And I think that I sort of do something like that within a Jewish context. And so we have various podcasts, we have various classes, not so much these days because people aren't still wanting to meet in person. But I believe in Jewish ideas. I believe in Jewish thought. I believe that knowing something more about one's faith can actually bring you one step further and make you one step better as a person of that faith.
Amazing. Very good. And are you from Canada originally?
I'm from Canada originally. I spent about a dozen years in the U.S., about 10 years in the U.S., and then I came back about 8-9 years ago, and I'm back in Montreal, and it's a city that I love. I always imagined wanting to come back here. It's central. It feels European according to the way that everybody says it. But to me, it just feels very Montreal. And whatever we put up with in the months and months of cold, which we're about to get into, is more than tempered by the amazing summers and springs that we have here in Montreal. I'm sure Stephen, who spent time in Montreal, will attest to that as well.
That's right. That's how. So I used to live in Montreal. I went to university there. I did my master's there. And I lived in Montreal. The hottest I've ever been in my life has been in Montreal. And the coldest I've ever been in my life is Montreal. It is the extremes, right? But that's sort of how we met. It wasn't we never knew each other actually in Montreal, but Avi was wanting to start a podcast where he talks to like a Christian theologian or a Christian pastor. And he got in touch with a friend of ours in Montreal who runs a church. And he said, who should I talk to? And Graham said, you need to talk to Stephen Backhouse. And so
I wanted to talk to Graham, and Graham is busy, and he just, it's not for me, but you need to talk to Stephen. So
there we go.
That was it.
Yeah. And so we
launched a podcast.
Yeah. We started the podcast together, which has been going for half a year now. And it's really good fun.
Yeah. It's called Hyphen. And it's where, like I say, it explores the hyphen between Judeo and Christian. And we're not interested in converting each other. We don't convert other people. We just like to explore what Jews need to know about Christianity and what Christians need to know about Judaism. and we've had a rollicking time with it.
And of course, the joke is that if one of us converts, then the podcast ends immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
No music, nothing. It just stops.
Well, I'm glad to have advance notice on that in case it ends, but I'm so excited to get a little glimpse into the kind of conversations that you guys have been having. But any of our listeners who enjoy this might also enjoy picking up that Hyphen podcast, right? It's
sure
very informative. I've learned an awful lot from it. So, Stephen, in case people are just joining us and haven't seen you before, tell us about tent theology, because it's kind of cool too.
Well, I'm kind of the Christian version of what Avi is doing in Montreal, because so Avi has the Jewish Living Labs, or it was the Learning Labs, now it's the Living Labs.
We rebranded,
and I probably should rebrand as well. But so the way this, in the very similar way to the way that Avi decided not to be some pointy-headed academic, but he's bringing Jewish learning and theology into normal life. That is what I did with Christian theology. So a few years ago, I was working as an academic in a seminary, and I quit my job in order to pursue theology more. And I took my show on the road, as it were, and I started this thing called tent theology, which is a way of bringing theology into other spaces besides academia. So I did go to local churches, and I also would get hired to come and talk to businesses or charities, organizations that are trying to think Christianly about what they're doing. And then COVID happened, and so I couldn't travel anymore. So I started, like everyone, doing more online things and talking to people all across the world and starting podcasts and things. But it's still the same sort of work, which is bringing theology into spaces that people don't normally have it there. And it's for living and learning, not for getting some sort of authentic, full-time Christian job at the end of it. We're not trying to do that. We're just trying to learn and live with our theology.
And you even brought it into the space of worship leaders in the Vineyard. I mean, imagine that. So the class that you ran, Politics and Praise, was just absolutely fantastic. And I was speaking to someone who was on that online class, and they said that it has absolutely changed how they think about absolutely everything.
Oh, wow.
So I think that's a win, isn't it?
That's a win. See,
yeah, that's a
theology
win.
into online praise and worship spaces. So there you go. You never thought you needed it. You didn't even know what you needed, and now you've got it.
It's great. So encouraging. Thank you guys for what you do. And I'm excited to dialogue with the pair of you a bit about worship. So can we just dive right into our conversation? I ask every guest that comes on, what is worship? And so Stephen has already answered this question exceptionally well.
I want to hear Stephen's answer before, give me the précis before I dive in.
Do you even remember what you said, Stephen?
Harmony, didn't I talk about worship as justice? The idea that in a just society, everyone gets what is owed to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was a theologian named Augustine who pointed out, he said, the reason why Rome collapsed was that it was a society in which not everyone was getting what was owed to them, because one of the beings in that world was God, and God wasn't getting what was owed to God, which is worship. So that you think of worship as an actual attribute of justice, and that you are giving back what that being deserves. And if God exists, then the only thing that God deserves is worship. So we sort of started from there, and we built on the politics of worship and praise from beginning with the idea of justice.
Excellent. It was good the first time. It was good the second time.
But it took an hour to talk. It took an hour to talk about that the first time. But here I did in 30 seconds. But Avi, I want to know what I've never asked Avi what he thinks worship is.
So that's interesting. Judaism, we have spoken about this, that one of the fundamental differences between Judaism and Christianity is that Judaism is very much act-centered as opposed to, thought-centered, right? It's not Judaism doesn't think about the acts as just loving, one another and loving God and moving on, right? That there's a lot of things that one does, right? And prayer and worship definitely falls into that sphere. And so on the one basic level, worship is the act of going and praying to God 3 times a day, and preferably communally, right? And so the act of convening together is a central part of the idea of worship, I think, within Jewish thought. But that doesn't preclude you from praying if you do not have a communal space. You still pray alone. I don't always manage to get to services morning and evening to pray, but that doesn't mean that I don't pray. And so prayer, right, the act of praying 3 times a day at a most basic level is the thing that one does as a Jew. Does the act of prayer count or matter if you're just parroting it, if you're just going through the motions? Not necessarily, right? In some instances, yes, in some instances, no, and it gets very technical, and we're not going to get into that. But what I think it highlights, and this to me is an essential feature and not a bug within the Jewish world, and I think it extends to all other faiths, is the tension between what I'll refer to in Hebrew words, and I'll translate them, between keva and kavanah. Right, keva is, and they sound familiar, and that's where the beautiful allusions and alliterations lie in there. Keva is the act of doing something with regularity, and kavanah is the act of focusing oneself. And that the two act on each other, right? Praying regularly doesn't mean that you will always have that inner focus and that, connection that one has with the divine, but praying regularly allows those moments to happen, right? And having those moments would not exist without having that regularly. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot pray regularly without having moments of beautiful focus and attention and mindfulness towards the divine. And you will never have these intense moments of divine connection without having a regular prayer practice. I mean, people will have these moments of awe, but they're really like few and far between if you do not have those. And so I think that, right, those two live sometimes in tension with each other, because praying 3 times a day, often many of the same words, leads you to get bored. And that's okay, because, that you will, the fact that you know those and you have that rote concept of doing it all the time will make you have more and more often moments of that awe and that connection and that transcendence when you stop and think about the words that you're saying and have that meaningful moment. And I don't know if that's true for you, where you can be repeating a hymn hundreds of times, right? And you're like, oh, okay, great. And you're just not feeling it a certain Sunday morning, but it's in the hymnal and you got to say it. But that allows one to have those moments of transcendence when all of a sudden that hymn really hits you, right? And you really open up to it. And so that, to me, in not such a nutshell, is the idea of worship, right? It's that we pray so that we can have those moments of connection. But right, the flip side of that is God doesn't necessarily need that. And this goes back to where Stephen was talking about it, right? We owe God this worship, but God doesn't need our worship. Right. And so theologians will discuss this right across all religions, right? And some of my favorites are, well, God knows that we need to pray, and so God enjoins us to pray, right? That worship is important for humans, and therefore God creates this mandate around prayer and around worship. Another one of my favorite ideas in that sphere is, when people wonder, why should I pray if God doesn't answer my prayers, right? And the former chief rabbi of the British Empire, Lord Jonathan Sacks, who passed away a little over a year ago, points out that God always answers your prayers. Sometimes the answer is no. Right.
Yeah.
And so that is just as essential in terms of thinking for Jewish prayer and Jewish thought. I don't know if that answers it or not.
That's a really good answer. That is super helpful. What were those two words again that you said at the start?
Keva and kavana. Keva is rote, regularity, the idea of doing something, all the time, right? It's the habit forming, right? The things that you do out of habit that allow you to do things, that are great. And kavana is the focus, is the attention, right? And we see this in modern productivity, this whole cult of productivity around these days, where you see many people say, have your morning routine set out perfectly, right? And do it with regularity, because that will allow you to have great moments of productiveness during that time, because you've set out all of this and you don't have to think about.
You're not trying to recreate, like start
every
again
day.
every single day, which is something that like I'm not speaking for Harmony. I'm speaking for myself. Somebody who has spent quite a lot of time in certain circles of Christianity, where they look at the rote kind of liturgy or the rote religious aspects of Christianity and think, oh, that's just boring and dull. And it's like, it's empty of all authenticity. We need to get the real emotion. We need to worship needs to be real. And so they're always kind of recreating environments. They're always basically trying to start again to find that real moment. Is that something you recognize, Harmony?
Oh, completely. Yeah, completely. There's a lot of tension because the rote part of it, the rhythm, the habit part of it is seen as like religious in a bad way.
I've had this talk with Avi before, because religious doesn't mean bad in Judaism.
Yeah. It can mean very bad in our context, right?
Amongst Christians of a certain type, of which Harmony and I both are, the word religious is like the thing you use for people who kind of are just going through the motions and don't really mean what they say.
Yeah, it's weird. I'm thinking about this interesting thing that I haven't thought about in years, but I remember thinking very hard about this for about a few weeks, like several years ago, where I was like fascinated by people who were speaking in tongues.
Okay.
Right. And if you think about it, speaking in tongues, and it's not necessarily part of any of our traditions, but it exists very much and it's very alive in certain Christian circles, is the thing which gets you away from.
Yeah, it is. Okay. It exists in our circles. Yeah.
Yep.
Sure. Which gets away from the roteness, right? It's about saying I'm transcending it all, right? Yes. I'm just speaking what's in my heart and what's in my godly language. Yeah. And I had this moment, and I had this question in my mind, and I was like, does everybody speak in tongues differently or speak in tongues the same? And there's got to be research on this. So I went and Googled, or I went into JSTOR, to do all this like academic research. Turns out linguists have been studying people who speak in tongues for a very long time. And they notice that people who speak in tongues speak differently, whether they are speaking in tongues as Russians, right, or Americans or Spanish-speaking people, and that they are relying on morphemes and phonemes and various sounds that are already in their brain as speakers of this language. And so as much as you try to force this idea of like transcending the roteness, you're always coming back to the roteness, right?
You're using the patterns that you learn.
That you learn in your own speech, exactly. That you don't know, there's no transcending that. That is part of who you are.
But when you do sing in tongues, you are like in the flow. It's almost like that thing that you described, Abby, of setting out your tools in the morning. Like interesting. You can be transported into a place where you feel like there is no rules, but you're probably just following some pretty deeply set.
That's the point patterns. Of what these linguists are like pointing out, is that you can put a Russian evangelical, right, in an American evangelical church and have them speak in tongues, and it will sound fundamentally different because of the way in which this person speaks in day-to-day life. Fascinating to me.
Is there anything like that in Judaism? Is there any kind of ecstatic, mystical worship or free form, emotional worship?
The world of Hasidism, right, the idea of the mystic, right, form of Judaism, or the everyday mystics, right, is really 17th century invention for popular individuals, right? And that's the people that you see on the streets today that dress Hasidic, right, with the black hats and the long black coats, and that say to themselves, and they are descendants of that movement. They are part of that movement, and the Hasidic world has a whole separate level of devotion and thoughtfulness about connecting with God. The idea that you connect with God at any point in time, that worship is an all the time thing, but they also have this idea of mystical connections. There's no necessarily speaking in tongues, but you have, I don't know, in the Hasidic world, like for example, there's a concept that certain Hasidic communities will have, which is what they refer to as hitbodedut, which literally means aloneness. And it's like, go out into the forest, right? Or go where no one will hear you and talk to God in a way that you can't talk if other people are around, where there might be shame. Right. So as a colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, who is a very, very Hasidic individual, says when he was becoming more in this world of Hasidism, he says his teacher put him in his little minivan that he had to drive around in Israel, and drove him out in the middle of the forest, right, and then let him out, and he drove away. And he says, I'm only coming back in 4 hours, right? So like, you got all this time now, and nobody's around to hear you. Don't worry, you won't get lost. I'll pick you up. And he says that was the first time that he was able to really open up, because there was nobody around. So that's a very Hasidic, way of like prayer, and that's that ecstatic way of thinking about it. And song also plays large in the world of the Hasidic communities, where they will use these wordless songs and sing them for extended periods of time to really get beyond the basic, right? Then that's again using the keva, using the roteness of taking a wordless melody and singing it for an hour, right, over and over and over again.
Does that sound familiar to you, Harmony?
B section, A section, B section. I'm curious to hear how you guys do this. And if you do that for an hour, then you in theory can get transported and really, really get to the depth of it and to the depth of yourself. So yeah.
Well, who knew that there would be so much overlap? That's exactly the kind of thing a question that we would get a lot is, why do you sing that same chorus or B section over and over and over again in your church? Now, we try not to do it for an hour. Most people lose interest long before that. But repetition is a huge part of worship in our sort of kind of charismatic type churches. So that's very, very interesting, isn't it, Stephen? You're smiling like, yeah, I've been there. I've been in those repeat.
I'm interested that we both, because you're both musical and you both play instruments and are trained more.
I don't really play the instruments.
You play more of an instrument than I do.
No, I joke that I play the stereo. I'm really, really good at that. With one button, with one finger, I can conjure worlds. But I've tried many, many instruments, and it never really stuck with me. I understand music. I understand the language of music, because music is a huge part of my life. But I've never really had it in me to dive in and really play.
One of the reasons why I like Avi so much is that he knows the people that sing on Leonard Cohen albums, and he knows people that sing with Leonard Cohen. So this is my hero here.
That's pretty cool.
My wife is a clergy member as well, and she is one of the clergy at this synagogue in Montreal called the Congregation Shara Shamayim, which is the synagogue where Leonard Cohen grew up and had his bar mitzvah, and in the last albums of his life wanted to join this and appreciate the sounds of his youth, and he brought the choir, which is comprised of all good friends of mine or acquaintances, and the cantor who is a very good friend of mine, to come and sing on the last album, and then the posthumous album where they did a couple of other tunes. So there is that Leonard Cohen connection,
which I'm very jealous of.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask was, okay, fine, Avi, you're not a musician, but you are a lot closer to the musical world than I am, and Harmony is a musician, and I find it interesting that both of you immediately, we're talking about worship, but you immediately turn to talking about music. So what is now, because in my life, music and worship are not the same thing. So why is it that you both so quickly turned, when we talk about worship, you so quickly started talking about musical forms?
I think that's where we found some real overlap. I think you were talking about prayer, weren't you, initially, Avi? Where we started to really kind of sense, oh, that the Hasidic tradition and then our Vineyard Church tradition was in the music sphere. I think that's
I didn't really go right into that. I spoke
Okay.
about the nature of prayer and connecting, and then we
Yeah.
started, once we get into the mystical sides, that there was a lot of that singing there.
Yeah.
And music is definitely part of much of the worship, but if one sings nothing, right, in the prayer service in Judaism, it's one has fulfilled one's obligations, right? One has prayed without any sort of melody whatsoever, and that's totally fine. So music is a sufficient but not necessary condition for prayer in the Jewish tradition, or for worship in general.
And does it have to be prayer? Can acts of obedience be considered worship? Could study be considered worship?
Good question.
Gardening.
So, going back to that Hasidic tradition, I think about this famous story. And again, these Hasidic stories, whether they happened or whether they didn't, is irrelevant.
Well of wonderful stories, yeah.
Right, is about these two individuals, this Hasid and this leading non-Hasidic, right? A Hasidic or anti-Hasidic leader are speaking to each other and talking and walking, and they come across a Hasid who is praying, right, the daily prayers while changing his wheel and fixing it and lubricating the axle and stuff like that. And the chassid, the anti-chassid, who's trying to make a point, is like, look at this. This is what happens when you turn everything into Judaism, into prayer, right? This guy who is clearly not fit for worship because his hands are filthy and he's in the muck and he's praying, right, the morning services because that's what he's doing it. And the Hasidic rabbi goes and says, no, look at the opposite of that, right? This is a person who is willing to like connect with God even in the depths of filth and in the most mundane moments, right? So in that sense, that's definitely a thought around the Hasidic world. I think prayer has a very specific, idea. Torah study or study of ideas in general might not be considered prayer per se, but it is a fundamental thing, right? And I would go back to one of the early sayings of the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah period, which is the immediate post Second Temple era, where they're finally writing down some of these ideas of the early rabbinic era. And one of the early statements is that the world stands on three pillars, right? Of course, 3 is the minimum that one needs. You can't have a world that stands on 2 and 4 or whatever. So 3 pillars. And what are the 3 pillars? On Torah, which is Torah study or ideas, right? Avodah, which is worship, and Gemilut Chasadim, which is acts of loving kindness, right? And the 3 are fundamentally interrelated and important, but they are their own separate spheres of existence and consciousness within, Judaism. That being said, there's definitely a lot of overlap between those two, right? One prays a small prayer before one studies in the morning, right? If you're going to open up a study, many people will have a small prayer that they will do before and after as a way of like focusing themselves. One prays a blessing before one eats any food, and that's a mini meditation, right? That takes 5 seconds before and maybe a minute or 2 afterwards. But the idea that like one brackets all one's acts with a form of prayer. Right, is the act of eating itself the prayer, right? Thich Nhat Hanh would go and say that that's absolutely the prayer itself, that the act of worship itself is savoring, right, the mandarin one slice at a time, one wedge at a time. And the Jewish concept is to say, well, that might not be itself prayer or worship, but by centering it beforehand and afterwards with a grace before and a grace after, right, we are turning that into a sacred act in and of itself. But then again, you have a modern concept of, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a big 20th century Jewish theologian, used to say that when he was marching, for example, he marched in Selma with Martin Luther King, and he said that was praying with his feet. Right, that marching in a civil rights march was praying with one's feet. So where that overlaps and doesn't, is it strictly prayer? Is it not? That's where, we open this up to the wide world of interpretation and to really I'm not going to go and say that certain things are definitively or are not definitively, because there's so much to be had there and to be learned.
That was a fantastic answer. I love that so much. So moving on from there then, but related to it, in our tradition, the worship leader is the person, usually a guy, at the front on a guitar leading the songs. That's the worship leader. Who is the worship leader in your tradition?
So, we can speak in broad strokes, and then we can know that different denominations within Judaism and different approaches will have different, and even within different denominations are different types of congregations. So there is a prayer leader, right? In Hebrew, it is referred to as the chazan, who is the precentor, or the Baal Tfilah, or the Shaliach Tzibur, right? The Baal Tfilah is the person who we send to lead the prayers. The Shaliach Tzibur is it's a beautiful term, and it's a meaningful term, right? Where one says, you are the representative of the community. You are the person who the community has sent to lead, right? And as such, you become somebody who has been nominated, right? Somebody who's been chosen by this, and you are sent, right? And you're not just doing it out of your own, I get to do this. And nowadays in English, we refer to it as a cantor often. But a cantor is a specific sort of tradition where one is leading in a cantorial manner often. More often than not nowadays without a choir, because choirs are expensive and hard to maintain, but sometimes with a choir, and that it is a very specific form of cantorial singing. But in every synagogue, in every communal form of prayer, there is always a prayer leader. In the Orthodox tradition, it will almost always be male, although there are certain congregations that are now finding spaces for women to lead certain parts of the prayer, even though they may not necessarily count as part of the quorum of men that one needs to have a prayer. So we can get into how one liberalizes Orthodox and traditional traditions, but that's beyond the discussion here now. So you generally have in Orthodox traditions a male leading these parts of the prayer, and often it is call and response, right? The prayer leader will say certain things, and people will who have said all this stuff will respond amen, or they will respond, holy, 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 and things like that. So there is a prayer leader in a strict sense. As you move to liberal traditions, you will see people using instruments. You will see male and female interchangeably that are prayer leading. And you will, and again, depending on the congregation, right? Our congregation has somebody who leads professionally. That is their job, and that is their full-time job, is that they are the prayer leader for the services. And other congregations that are a lot smaller, but have a lot of people that know how to do the prayers, would never think to hire a full-time prayer leader, because everybody is capable of doing that. And they might only bring in somebody special, or somebody who has a beautiful voice who has certain melodies for holidays and for special prayer services. But that anybody can, right? That it's very democratic in theory. Anybody can and does often lead prayer services in many different congregations. And as, again, one liberalizes, you see it equal parts male and female. You will see musical instruments, whereas in the traditional congregations and Orthodox congregations, there are no instruments on the Sabbath, and as a result, you rarely see instruments in synagogue life because instruments are prohibited on the Sabbath. And so that, brackets that. What's interesting is you're starting to see in some congregations that have, maybe Hasidic leanings or tendencies, even though they may be much more traditional, they'll find weekday services where they can use musical instruments in order to entice people and to sort of say, yeah, we'll have a musical service, this time because it's the new moon and we want to do that. And everybody with instruments are welcome to come and join in, or we have a band for this. So that's starting to happen but only on weekday services, which are different from Sabbath. And on Sabbath in traditional circles, you don't really see, you don't see any instruments, and you absolutely will see it in more liberal congregations.
Very interesting. Stephen,
I was going to ask, so as you probably know, Avi, in the Christian world, like sacred music, sort of, they'll call it worship music or whatever. I mean, it's its own industry. Like people will buy albums and listen to it, in the car, or listen to it as they go shopping or whatever. Like it's a thing they'll listen to. There's whole radio stations just devoted to Christian
music. Same thing in the Jewish world. Yes, so the Jewish world has a definite, there's a very developed Jewish music world with its own superstars and its own albums and all these things. What you will find, interestingly, is because in the Christian world, they're often listening to these albums in order to find the popular hits that can then be sung on Sundays. Is that correct?
They'll be playing it in churches as well as playing it for fun.
Yeah. So what'll happen is that in certain congregations where you have, let's say, popular, or it's a very, this music is very popular, you will find people taking these melodies and adapting them to prayer context, whether it's the actual song itself, or and there's a technical term for this in musicology called contrafacta, where you take the melody of one song and you adapt it to the lyrics of another. And so they'll take a popular melody that wasn't really written with these words of this prayer in mind, and they'll adapt it so that they can sing this popular melody in services on the Sabbath. But it's all a cappella, because on Sabbath there's no instruments, and and that's it. Yeah. So you find that the singers that are savvier, and I've never really done this musicologically studied, but I bet you that it's there, is that there's such an emphasis on singable a cappella melodies, right, on that top line, and not this reliance on chordal structures underneath that you need in order to make the music work. Because if you sing it without accompaniment, you have to be able to get to it right away.
Fascinating. Yeah, you'll have to see after this program, you need to give me some names of
absolutely
your equivalent.
You want to know what the Jewish Hillsong is, right?
I do. I know.
Without the sexual stuff on the side.
Without all the controversy.
Yes, please. Without all of that would be great. But yes, I'm really curious.
Without the cover
opened up a whole new world. And this thing about the top line is fascinating. So interesting.
Harmony, are you kind of envious of this idea that you could have music that you don't have to reproduce word note for note with all the instruments in church? Like you're free from the idea of having to reproduce the popular production values and just put them into the church?
Well, I am already personally free from that pressure, but I talk to many people who are very much still inclined to try to reproduce everything, every last bit of how Hillsong does it or Bethel does it, and just we'll get the backing tracks and everything, and it's got to sound exactly right. Which there's a lot of reasons why I struggle with that. A key one is just simply creativity. There's no imagination in that at all. But
it's like Taylor Swift recreating her whole album, whole catalog, right, note for note and sound for sound. But you're like, there's no point in doing that, right? She has a point in doing that because she wants to own these masters again.
Yeah.
You're saying in church, just have fun with it. You have wonderful creative musicians.
Mm-hmm.
You let them redo the arrangements, and
you're not just karaoke. You're not just
interesting stuff.
Music karaoke. Yeah,
that's right. And if you don't have an electric guitarist that can play like that, you shouldn't have to pretend like you do. So there's a lot of pretending, I think, that then happens, and pressure just to be super slick and awesome. So I love this idea of the top line and the vocals and people singing. And because of COVID, I think we all have a whole new appreciation for the sound of people's voices together, whether that's speaking or singing. And just hearing our people sing right now is like, it's like a healing to my soul. I don't want to drown them out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm curious if you have the same feeling that a lot of people do in the Jewish world that are not necessarily super into it and only listening to this music, but as somebody who probably listens to a lot of this worship music that's coming out, but also probably, I'm guessing, listens to a lot of other music as well. And I have Sirius XM, and I tune into the Christian channels once in a while, although I want to hear your recommendations for what you think is particularly good as opposed to what they're playing. Do you get really frustrated and disappointed at the real stagnation that exists within worship music, that they're really stuck like in the 90s U2 soaring anthems sort of world, and they haven't really progressed beyond that or using new ideas or new sounds or new vocabularies for doing worship music, but they're really stuck in this very specific way of understanding what worship should sound like?
Yeah, I think what frustrates me is that the people that are creative and are doing something new and fresh don't make it to that profile where we've all heard them and are listening to them.
Because it doesn't sound like what that is.
Yeah. So I know that they're out there. I just don't know that they are appealing in the Christian music industry necessarily. But I think that the main thing that concerns me is whether or not we sing about Jesus, whether we sing about God, whether the focus of our worship is actually the cult of self. And so I'm actually a bit more concerned about the message than the music ultimately, because of what that forms. I'm thinking about my kids who are teenagers. I don't like what they're listening to, and it's not worship music necessarily, and it's forming something in them. But even some of the worship music, what does that form in them? What do they think about who God is? And when we sing a lyric like "He's never gonna let me down," what does that mean to them? Does that mean that it's like the McDonald's drive-in, or I put my money in the machine?
It goes back to that message of what I said before, that God sometimes lets you down, and that's your answer, right? And that's okay, and you have to accept that. But it's a very adult, mature way of like thinking about what that is. There's a popular song actually that it struck me because I just heard it recently, and I'm gonna pull up the lyrics, and I wanna, because I had that same sort of moment, right? Because in the chorus, right, don't ever let, he taught, there's tati is Yiddish for father, right? Tati, my king, father, I plead, don't ever let go of me, ever let go of me, right? And if that's it's a very simple way of understanding the relationship that one has with God, and it's an incredibly popular song, right? And it sounds like if I just went and said, instead of Tati, my king, you'd say Jesus, right? They would totally translate well in terms lyrically as the chorus, right? Into that. And then sometimes we don't take God's hand. Sometimes we reach out for God's hand and it's not there, but that doesn't mean that God isn't there. What's the popular footsteps, the footprints in the sand thing, right? And God is sometimes, right? God stops walking next to you, but that doesn't mean that God has abandoned you, right? And that doesn't mean that God, right? And I see it in that way. I think, Stephen, you would probably concur as a theologian that to think that one always has one's hand and one has that closeness is a little childish, but that's what music does, right? Music gives us these tropes, and it's hard to sing about God that is complicated, right, in a pop song.
Yeah, I often kind of worry, certainly like Protestant Christians especially are very wordy people, and so they often think that by talking about a thing it's the same as doing it, or singing about it is the same as like they put a lot of weight onto words. And so here's Harmony like saying, she's concerned about some of the messages that come through, and you find a lot of worship music tries to load a lot of information into its lyrics as well, and sometimes I wonder whether that could also be an issue. So sometimes they're too simplistic, and then you worry about the simplistic messages they're getting, and then sometimes they're overly complicated, and I always wonder, like, what is the role that song lyrics are actually having in the formation of our imaginations? Because clearly it is an element, but I almost would like to see wordless music become more to the prominence, actually, in religious settings, because I would just be interested to see how if that would maybe help some of our issues here, that we wouldn't load the music with having to do all the heavy lifting.
I think theology and music are not always, best friends with each other, do not always have what to say to each other, and that the role of music isn't necessarily to hold heavy theology.
Yeah.
Food for thought. I would love to talk about another thing. So before we run out of time, do you mind if I just shift? I mean, we could talk about music. We could talk about how Avi plays the boron. So you say you're not a musician, but you play the boron. And I think that's a really good reflection for us, Stephen, for sure, about the importance of lyrics and music and the power of music. But I really, really, really want to talk to you about Sabbath. Really excited to talk to you about Sabbath. And one of my very favorite books is, and I'm glad you've mentioned him already, Abram Joshua Heschel's book, Sabbath. It's one of the books that I read over and over again, and every time I read it, I feel like I'm reading it for the first time. And I just love the book so much. And since I have been an adult and been really busy and had a full life and been desperate for some rest, I've thought, oh, actually, Sabbath is a great idea. But I fell in love with the Sabbath when I read that book. Like, it just captured my heart. I had a whole new hunger for it. And the book is really beautifully written too. I know that's a huge part of it, but I would love to hear your thoughts on Sabbath. And I know we won't cover everything because we don't have enough time, I'm sure.
Well, I'm curious, what does Sabbath mean for both of you, right? In the Christian imagination, before we, introduce all these new ideas.
Yeah, well, so that was one of my next questions for you, is like, what is it like for you talking to people outside of your tradition who are trying to understand Sabbath, and for myself trying to practice it? What I think Sabbath, what I understand it as now, coming back to the religious thing, as a younger person, I understood Sabbath to be about you're not allowed to do anything. It's restrictive. And yet now that I'm older, I want to receive the rest and the gift of the Sabbath. I want to see human flourishing. And I think that Sabbath is a great way to see humanity flourish. I think I struggle with Sabbath in my tradition because I don't feel like I really know what I'm doing, and I'm doing it in isolation, so rather than in community. So it's about work stoppage, I guess, in my experience, how I practice it. Worship, prayer, joy, food, limiting busyness and activity during that day, maybe not driving around here, there, and everywhere, maybe not going to every shop. So that's my summary of how we try to do Sabbath.
Sure. Stephen, what's your add-on to that?
Well, maybe a bit like Harmony. So I grew up thinking of Sabbath, which was always a Sunday. So first of all, the Sabbath was a Sunday, and it was a religious day. So it was the day you go to church 2 times, maybe 3 times if you're really unlucky, 3 times in a day or 2 times in a day. And it was the day when you couldn't watch Disney and you couldn't watch TV, and it just was a kind of a boring day. And then as I got older, I started to think of it more as a day of rest, which was quite often for me is a day of rest from religious things as well. So in fact, to me, a Sabbath day would be a day in which I don't go to churches and I don't do spiritual things.
Yeah,
where I
I always point
genuinely
out that
rest.
the ultimate irony for religious professionals,
Yes.
right, is
Yeah.
that the Sabbath is a work day.
This is what I
Mhm.
realized, that Sunday
Mhm.
was a work day for me. Going to churches is work.
Mhm.
And it's not necessarily all bad. It's just his work. And so for me, my Sabbath day will either be a Sunday in which I don't do anything work related, which includes going to churches, or if I have to be at some church on a Sunday, then I will take a Sabbath day on another day, like on a Saturday or another
Yeah.
day of the week. And I will not work, will not check emails, will not do anything, will not, if I have a deadline pressing, I will not work on the deadline, will actively seek things that will restore my soul rather than sort of use it up.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a day of rest.
Yeah. My wife used to call
means.
herself my wife used to call herself, because she would work on the Sabbath, and I don't
Yeah.
nearly as much because I'm not a synagogue professional. She used to call herself a Wednesday Adventist.
Right. Okay.
But yeah. So I would break it down. I mean, again, growing up, right, to me, Sabbath was this day that you couldn't do a lot of different things, and you went to services and you had these big meals, and it was beautiful and it was nice. But as I grew up, I started realizing the more you read and the more you get into it, and Heschel is definitely a beautiful, explainer of the idea of Sabbath. Although, to be fair, he throws you Christians under the bus when he goes and talks about how, other religions build, sanctuaries in space, and we build sanctuaries in time. Right. And the idea that the Sabbath is this sanctuary that we can carry with us wherever we are, because we don't need this place to do it.
Okay.
And he forgets that there are Christians that want to have that day of rest, and forgets that there are Jews that love building sanctuaries in space and have really, really large synagogues with beautiful everythings.
Mm-hmm.
So I would answer what Sabbath is for myself, as well as how I would approach it for Christians, because what I would take from this and add onto it the layer of Jewish law, which I know and I live with and is inherent to me, and one doesn't have to really, do that if one is not committed to this observant Orthodox Jewish lifestyle. So we can bracket that piece, but know that I take it to a different level and in a different way. But I'm thinking about the principles of what Sabbath is. And so I would start at the very beginning with what's the purpose behind Sabbath in the book of Genesis, right? In the second chapter, what does it say? I know Stephen's not good with Bible quotations, but maybe you are, Harmony.
Oh, dear.
Shots fired. Wow.
So I don't know if if you can think about, right, where it talks about in the beginning of Genesis, right, the notion of rest on Sabbath, right,
Mm-hmm.
and that we rest because God rested,
Mm-hmm.
right, and that the essential element and the essential feature of Sabbath in the Jewish imagination then is to not work, because there's plenty of work that one still, quote unquote, does on the Sabbath. It's that one refrains from creative work. The same way that God worked for 6 days, and God took the seventh day to contemplate and to appreciate the creative work of the rest of the first initial week, right? That is our job on the Sabbath, is not to not work, but to take that time and be reflective of the other time of the week when we have created. And so one should think about non-creative acts, right? Instead of just saying, right, what does this mean for me to just cease everything, right? To not work, right? Not work is impossible, because everything one does in some way in the world, or another, is work. Are you going to go so far as like observant Jews who prepare their Friday night meal before Friday night and their Sabbath lunch meal so that they're not cooking at all on Sabbath? Cooking could be considered as a form of work if you don't like to cook, but you still have to eat on the Sabbath, right? And so my message to Orthodox observing, or however you want to define it, people that aren't ready to like take on this full what Sabbath means for Jews sort of approach, is to first start and ask yourself, where is the creative outlets in my life? And often that's around work, and often that's around other things. And how am I going to cease from doing those things so that I can appreciate what the work is that I've done the rest of the week? Because if you're always producing, you're never really contemplating.
Right.
That's so
Think about
good.
how often, as a microcosm of that, think about how often we record these podcasts, hand them off to the producer, and often forget to go back and listen to them ourselves to think about the creative work that we have done, right? Because you're like, oh, it's out of my mind. I'm on to the next podcast already, right? And this happens all the time. I know Stephen, he's the one that messages me sometimes. Have you heard this podcast? There was an error in there and we got to fix it and call the producer. But that's fine. But like, it reminds me that I have to take that time and contemplate the creative acts that I have done the rest of the week, or the creativity that I've done. And that for me is the essential form of Sabbath. Now, how do I do that? Right. I then go forward, again, Bible, to where's the big mention of the Sabbath? Right. Come on. This is not just like trivia. This is major, right?
Keep the Sabbath holy.
Keep the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments. It talks about, but there are two sets of 10 commandments, right? That are given, right? Where? Yeah. Come on. I'm not going to answer all these for myself. Where are the two sets of where are the two repeatings of the 10 Commandments?
Okay, Deuteronomy is one of them, right?
Yeah.
And
Exodus. Right.
So
there's the first mentioning, and then there's Moses retelling it right at the end of his life when he's giving these speeches, because he knows that he's going to, pass soon, and he wants to leave an intellectual legacy for the Israelites. But if you notice, and I don't know if it ever translates perfectly into English translations, and I'm sure some of them are good at pointing out the difference, in other places they are not. But in the Hebrew, there are two different words that are used. There are small differences in the two sets of 10 commandments, of the two retellings, the telling and then the retelling. And in one case, it says Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, right? And in the other place time, it says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, right? And to technically translate that one, it says protect, right, the day of Sabbath, right? Watch over it, right? Which means like observe it. And then the other one, Zachor, means to remember. And the rabbis have a field day with why these two words are mentioned. Of course, as they do, right? Because they're a bunch of Pharisees, right? Right, Stephen? We've talked about this, like Pharisee as a derogatory term. And the upshot of it, in the way that I conceive it, it's not my idea, but I've really grown so much from this, right? Is that one of them refers to the positive commandments that one does on the Sabbath, and one refers to the negative commandments that one avoids on the Sabbath. And so I always tell people that are taking on a Sabbath practice that picking up on those two things is the best way to start your Sabbath practice. Not only find something that you don't do, and it's important to find something that you do not do on the Sabbath, that you say, I'm refraining. It's that aforementioned creative break, right? That rest. I don't do certain things on the Sabbath. And again, within Orthodoxy, there's a lot of very specific categories of forbidden work that is seen as creative that we do refrain from doing. But if you're not bound by that, and that's okay, find those things that you absolutely don't do. It might be a text Sabbath where you don't pick up your screen at all, but you might pick up a Kindle because it's purely for reading, and that's okay, right? It might be that you don't do whatever X it is. You don't cook because you really like, and you're going to save going out to eat so that you don't have to prepare a meal because you hate preparing a meal for the Sabbath, for whatever Sabbath you decide is your day of rest, whether it's Saturday, whether it's Sunday, whether it's Wednesday, whether your Sabbath starts Friday night, whether your Sabbath starts the Saturday day and it does the whole Sabbath, however you want to define that. You find those things that you don't do, but equally important, you find things that you do that you leave for the Sabbath to make it special.
Okay.
Right. Where we have these wonderful meals where we do a lot of inviting. So I would say that the vast majority of the time when we have guests in our home for meals or for, other, afternoons and evenings, right, it invariably ends up around the Sabbath. Now, there's no rule against having guests on a Wednesday, but that tends to be the day, and that makes the Sabbath day special. The kids have special board games that they'll play on the Sabbath, right? And they'll look forward to those things. I still have I'm a sucker for a good cherry Danish, like a cherry turnover where you get that cherry pie filling and, turn it into these mini pies, right? I used to love those. And there was a bakery near us when I was living in New Jersey that had really, really good ones. And I would always save them for Sabbath afternoon, right? To sort of say, well, the Sabbath is
Right.
like 2 hours left and you can just, go and do whatever in a couple hours, but you want to appreciate and enjoy those waning hours of Sabbath rest or enjoyment. I would save that Danish for Sabbath afternoon.
Yeah.
Right. And it's always looking for those things. So it's just as important to find the things that you do as much as you find the things that you don't do. And that to me encapsulates all of it. It's remembering that it's from Genesis, the idea that it's about creativity during the week and refraining from creative acts as work on Sabbath. And then that underscored by the 10 Commandments, where one goes and says, this is what we don't do, and this is what we do. That's the Sabbath.
That's a great summary of it. One thing that strikes me is you're talking about the creative work that we do during the week, but what if we are primarily consumers?
We are all creative in some way or another. I really believe that.
Yeah, I believe that too. I believe that
and
too.
I think that one has to stop and ask themselves, where am I creating? What are the things that I create? And how do I take that step back, right? Commerce, for example, buying things for a lot of people is creative because you didn't have that in your life before, and now you do. And that's why as Jews, one of the things that we do is we avoid buying and selling on the Sabbath because that's a fundamentally creative act. But for some people, that might not be creative at all. That might be the only time that they do. They have no attachment, right? They're very Buddhist to things, but the only time that they can really shop and enjoy it and take that time to reflect and contemplate because they're a clothing designer, because they have zero connection to clothing, whatever it is, might be on the Sabbath. And for you, again, as a non-observant Orthodox Jew, might say to themselves that Sabbath is that shopping is the one thing that I do on the Sabbath.
Amazing.
Right.
I'm going to make my husband listen to this podcast.
Should make everybody listen to this podcast and then listen to Hyphen, because we have these kinds of conversations all the time.
This is what we always
That's
do.
our plug. Yeah, I know.
I'd love to bring it full circle. Harmony, I know you're probably trying to bring it into land.
We've got a few more minutes.
I'd really like to listen. I'd like to ask Avi what the connection to worship is then. Sabbath rest and worship what's the connection?
Well, if you're a cantor, it's a work day. There is no rest.
Right.
Because you're leading services on the Sabbath.
But what about the person who's not working on the Sabbath?
So that becomes the time when people go to services often. People, if you're a person that goes one day a week, you're often going just on the Sabbath because you have that time. You're able to be creative, and services on Sabbath are longer.
Aside that time.
Yeah. There's a longer service. There's an additional service. There's a Torah reading, right? We read from the scroll, and we actually have that. And when we're not in a pandemic time, we have that communal like snack refreshments afterwards. We call it the Kiddush, which is really the gathering of community, right? Oftentimes prayer is just as much about that communal connection as otherwise. So Sabbath, right? If you have that time where you stop and able to think about, well, now's the time that we can connect with other people, right? Prayer and worship plays an integral role in that here's your chance to be with others, to pray with others, to connect and to commune with others in that way. So in that sense, Sabbath and prayer really are, in some way deeply connected because this is the time that one has to really go for that.
Yeah, I was thinking ahead of this conversation about how that same kind of force within me that makes it hard to stop on a Sabbath feels very similar to the same opposition or struggle that I feel when I'm trying to sit in silent prayer. I feel that same kind of battle. Can you comment on that at all? That's that challenge.
I guess I don't know. Sure, but that's a challenge across everything. I'm the last person to ask them that because I'm one of those book people that buy the books like Meditation for Skeptics and Meditation for People Who Are Restless and all that. And I'm not very good at it, even though I try and I try and I try. But I think it's the same impulses within human, movement, right? In human evolution, human action and activity that we are distracted by the very thing that sometimes is the most important thing for us to be doing.
Yeah, it's like learning muscle memory or something. I mean, it's like going to the
Mhm.
gym, isn't it? I mean, it's not. It gets better. Like it's kind of like the Sabbath might not be fun at first, but it's actually good for you, and then it gets better. The better you are at it, the better it is for you, and you do.
It's funny because I think that I would.
Yeah.
I'm struck by the fact that the people that go to the gym regularly and love it
Yeah.
probably would tell you, right? Oh, you know that feeling that you have about right worship, right? And how difficult, how easy it is for you, and how hard it is to go to the gym, right? Well, I have it in reverse, and I'll tell you right now, if you keep coming to the gym on a regular basis, right, and you push yourself, it's going to become easy, and it's going to become the thing that you love, and it's going to be amazing.
We're all projecting onto somebody else. We're all eating our vegetables, hoping it will taste like a cherry Danish eventually. That's
exactly.
Oh, and maybe that's a really good place to land this conversation with the cherry Danish, and the conversation has just been fantastic. Thank you both for your time, for your insight. It's been great, and it's been really wonderful to talk to someone from a different tradition about worship. I've really enjoyed that. So thank you for very patiently answering the questions and repeating words, and it's so informative. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll close with a quote that I found in Abraham Joshua Heschel's book when I was looking at it just ahead of this, and I could probably just sit here and read the entire book from start to finish, and that I would enjoy that. I'm not sure if anyone else would hang in there, but he says, Sabbath is a day of harmony and peace between man and man, peace within man, and peace with all things. And I just love that so much. Peace between man and man, peace within man, and peace with all things. And isn't that what we're after? And we so enjoyed chatting. Thank you both for the time.
Thank you, Harmony.
And it's been a pleasure. Bless you.